He thought the hardest part would be saying "I do" to a woman he did not love, but he would soon learn the hardest part was discovering he had been wrong about her. The wedding took place on a narrow ridge nearly a mile above the valley floor, where the wind never seemed to rest, and the air always carried the dry scent of pine and cold stone. Silas Mercer stood in his best coat, though the elbows had been patched twice and the cuffs still smelled faintly of horse leather and cedar smoke. His boots were polished, not because he cared about appearances, but because he believed a man should at least show respect when stepping into something permanent. The preacher spoke quietly, his words almost carried away by the mountain wind, while a small group of witnesses watched with the careful silence of people who understood this was not a wedding built on romance. This was an agreement, a necessity, a bridge between two worlds that did not trust each other. Silas kept his eyes forward at first. He had prepared himself for this the same way he prepared for winter. Emotion put aside, expectations lowered, heart locked away somewhere deep where disappointment could not reach it. He had been told she would be difficult, proud, untouchable, a woman who agreed to this marriage for reasons that had nothing to do with him. That was fine. He had done the same. Then she lifted her eyes. Ayanna did not look at him the way he expected, not with resentment, not with fear, not even with indifference. She looked at him the way someone studies the horizon before a long journey, calm, steady, measuring something deeper than appearances. Her dark hair was tied back with a simple leather cord, and around her neck rested a small silver charm dulled by time. Her hands were still, but not weak. These were hands that knew work, hands that had carried water, gathered wood, survived hard seasons. The kind of hands he understood. Snow from the night before still clung to the shaded side of the ridge, thin white lines tracing the rocks like unfinished thoughts. Somewhere below, a hawk cried into the open air. Silas realized he had been holding his breath. When the preacher finally nodded, Silas spoke his vows in a voice as steady as he could make it. Honest words. Simple words. Words about respect, about shelter, about doing his duty. Not words about love. He did not believe in promising what he did not yet possess. When it was her turn, Ayanna spoke just as simply. Her voice was low, clear, carrying the quiet strength of someone who did not waste language. She promised fairness. She promised honesty. She promised she would not bring shame to his home. She did not promise affection. Somehow that made Silas trust her more. When it was done, no one cheered. No music played. Just a few nods. A few exchanged looks of cautious relief. The kind people share when a storm might have been avoided. As they began the slow walk toward his small cabin a quarter-mile down the slope, Silas felt the strange weight of another person's footsteps beside his for the first time in years. He had lived alone long enough to forget what that sounded like. Two sets of boots on frozen dirt. Two shadows stretching across the pale afternoon light. He told himself nothing would change. This would be a quiet arrangement. Two decent people sharing a roof and little else. He believed that right up until the moment she paused at his doorway, touched the rough wood of the frame like she was greeting an old memory, and gave the faintest, almost invisible smile. And for reasons he could not yet explain, that small, quiet expression unsettled everything he thought he understood about the life waiting inside. The cabin was smaller than most men would have offered a new bride, barely 20 feet across with a low timber roof darkened by years of smoke. But it stood solid against the mountain wind, and that was what mattered up here. Silas pushed the door open and stepped aside, not out of ceremony but simple respect, the kind a man shows when he understands that space matters. Ayanna stepped in without hesitation, her eyes moving slowly across the single room, taking in the iron stove, the narrow bed against the far wall, the oak table worn smooth by years of solitary meals, and the single window that looked west toward a valley that disappeared into blue distance. She did not speak. She did not praise. She simply noticed. Silas set his hat on a peg and moved toward the stove, adding another split log even though the fire was already strong. Habit. When a man lives alone long enough, he learns to prepare for cold before it arrives. The scent of burning pine filled the room, dry and clean. Ayanna removed her gloves, placing them carefully on the table as if she already understood that nothing in this place had ever been careless. Outside, the late afternoon light stretched long across the snow patches, and the temperature was already dropping toward 25 degrees. Mountain evenings did not wait for anyone. Silas reached for a second tin cup and filled it from the kettle without asking, then placed it within her reach before taking his own. It was a small thing, just hot water with a pinch of wild mint. But it was the first decision he had made that included another person in years. She studied the cup for a moment before accepting it with a quiet nod. Not gratitude. Recognition. He noticed that. They sat across from each other at the table, the silence between them not sharp, just unfamiliar. Two people learning the shape of a quiet they now had to share. After a while she stood and moved toward the corner where his supplies were stacked. Dried beans in cloth sacks. 2 sides of cured venison. A coil of rope. Everything placed with the logic of survival. She adjusted one sack slightly, improving the balance without asking permission. Silas almost said something, then stopped. She was not changing his home. She was strengthening it. That difference mattered. As dusk settled in, the sky turning the color of old steel, Ayanna surprised him by kneeling near the hearth and adding a flat stone near the fire pit edge. He watched without interrupting. When he finally asked why, her answer was simple. The stone would hold heat longer into the night. Less wood burned. More warmth kept. He nodded slowly. That was the first thing she had given him that he did not already know. Later, as the first real cold crept into the walls and the wind began its steady low whistle outside, Silas took a folded blanket from a cedar chest and placed it on the bed before taking another for himself. No explanations. No awkward words. Just decisions made with quiet fairness. Ayanna noticed he chose the thinner blanket. She said nothing, but when he turned back from securing the door latch, he saw she had switched them. He almost objected, almost insisted. But something in her steady expression told him this was not charity. This was balance. For the first time since the preacher had spoken the final words that afternoon, Silas felt something unexpected settle in his chest. Not comfort. Not yet. But the beginning of something that did not feel like the long winter he had prepared himself for. Morning came quietly on the mountain, not with noise but with pale light slipping through the window and the soft ticking sound of cooling wood in the stove. Silas was awake before the sun cleared the ridge, the way he had been every day for the past 10 years. Routine had kept him alive longer than luck ever had. He pulled on his boots, stepped outside into air that could not have been more than 18 degrees, and checked the sky the way some men checked newspapers. Thin clouds, dry wind, no storm yet. When he returned, he stopped in the doorway without meaning to. Ayanna was already awake. She had tied her hair back again and was kneeling near the table, carefully sorting dried herbs he had never seen before. The faint smell of sage and something slightly sweet filled the cabin, mixing with the scent of yesterday's fire. She worked with quiet certainty, not asking where things belonged, simply finding the right places through instinct. He noticed she had already swept the floor with a simple branch broom he had never bothered to make. The space looked the same, but somehow more intentional. He poured water into the kettle and hesitated before speaking. "Do you always wake before sunrise?" She answered without looking up. "Where I come from, the day does not wait for those who sleep too long." He almost smiled at that. Neither does this mountain. They shared a small breakfast without ceremony. Beans warmed in a cast-iron pan. Dry bread softened near the stove. She ate slowly, thoughtfully, like someone trained to make little last longer. Afterwards, she surprised him by reaching for his heavy work coat. For a moment, he thought she meant to move it aside. Instead, she took a bone needle from a small leather pouch and began repairing a seam along the shoulder he had ignored for months. Her fingers moved with patience, pulling strong thread through worn fabric. With steady rhythm. "You do not have to do that," he said quietly. Her answer came just as calm. "I know." That was all. No explanation. No debt claimed. Just a choice. Later, while he checked the small corral 20 yards from the cabin, he noticed something else. The old gray mare that usually kept her distance was standing unusually calm near the fence. Ayanna stood nearby, her hand resting lightly against the animal's neck, speaking in a low voice he could not quite hear. The horse, stubborn with most people, did not move away. When she noticed him watching, she simply said, "Animals listen when you do not try to own their fear." Silas leaned on the fence rail, thinking about that longer than he expected. By midday, the temperature had climbed just above freezing, sunlight turning the frost into small rivers of water along the rocks. Ayanna had organized the woodpile into tighter stacks against the north wall where the wind struck hardest. Not more wood, just smarter placement. When he pointed it out, she gave a small shrug. Warmth is easier to keep than to find. That sentence stayed with him. That afternoon, she asked one question. Just one. Why did you agree to this? Silas took his time answering. Because peace is sometimes cheaper than pride. She studied his face for a long second, as if measuring the truth of that. Then she nodded once. That was the moment he realized something had shifted again. They were no longer just two strangers honoring an arrangement. They were becoming two people trying, carefully, not to misunderstand each other. And on that mountain, that was how trust always began. Not with grand promises, just with small mercies repeated until they became something neither person expected. That evening the wind came down the slope with a deeper voice, pushing against the cabin walls like a reminder that the mountain always tested anything that tried to stay upon it. Silas returned from checking the lower trail just before sundown, his gloves dusted with frost, his shoulders carrying the quiet fatigue of a man who measured his days in effort instead of hours. When he stepped inside, he noticed something different immediately. The cabin felt warmer, not from more fire, but from order. Ayanna had moved nothing important, yet everything seemed to breathe easier. The table now stood closer to the stove. The water bucket sat where it could not freeze overnight. Even the lantern had been hung at a height that spread light more evenly across the room. Small changes. Thoughtful changes. He set down a small cloth bundle without comment. Inside were 2 apples he had saved from his last trip to the trading post nearly 3 weeks earlier. He placed them on the table between them like something fragile. Her eyes lingered on the fruit, not with hunger but with quiet surprise. These do not grow on this mountain, she said softly. No, he answered. But sometimes it is worth carrying something sweet a long way. She cut one carefully with his pocket knife, dividing it into equal halves without asking, offering one piece back to him as naturally as breathing. Outside, the temperature dropped fast, the sky turning dark blue before settling into black. The first stars appeared sharp and cold above the ridge. Inside, the fire spoke in soft cracking sounds while they worked through the evening in a silence that no longer felt empty. At one point, Silas reached for a loose board near the door, meaning to fix it as he had planned for months. Before he could kneel, Ayanna was already there holding the nails steady. Their hands almost touched. Both paused for half a second, then continued as if nothing had happened. Later, she unfolded a small cloth from her belongings. Inside were carefully wrapped beads and a thin strip of soft leather. She worked by lamplight, threading the beads with steady focus. Silas did not ask what she was making. Some things earned their explanation later. After a while, she spoke without looking up. Where I come from, 2 people who share a roof must decide if they are only surviving or if they are building something. Silas considered that. I have only ever been good at surviving. She nodded slightly. Surviving is what keeps you here. Building is what makes staying worth it. That stayed in the room long after the words ended. As night settled deeper, Silas prepared his usual place on the floor, rolling his blanket out of habit. Before he could finish, Ayanna placed the beaded leather strip on the table beside him. For the doorway, she said. For good thought when people enter. He studied the simple work. Careful hands. Patient time. Why give this to me? Her answer came quiet and certain. Because this is my home now too. He did not answer right away. Outside, the wind moved across the mountain like a long breath. Inside, Silas finally understood something he had not expected to learn. A house could be built by one man, but a home always required 2. The next few days settled into a rhythm neither of them had planned, but both began to understand. The kind of quiet routine that forms when 2 careful people try not to step on each other's solitude. Mornings began with the same pale light sliding across the ridge and the same soft sounds of preparation. Water warming on the stove, boots brushing dust from the floorboards, the faint creak of leather as Silas prepared for the day's work. Ayanna had begun rising even earlier than he did, stepping outside barefoot for a few moments despite the cold, her breath turning to silver in the air as she watched the horizon as if listening for something older than weather. He did not ask why. Some habits deserved respect before understanding. One afternoon, he returned from clearing fallen branches along the trail and noticed a new sound coming from behind the cabin. A steady scraping, then a soft humming voice he did not recognize. When he walked around the corner, he found Ayanna repairing the small chicken coop he had nearly forgotten about, reinforcing the corners with strips of flexible willow she had cut from somewhere down the slope. You missed this place when you stacked the wood, she said simply. I noticed. He rested his arm on the fence rail, studying the work. That coop had stood crooked for 3 years. He had always meant to fix it. Somehow she had done it in one afternoon with nothing but patience and observation. That evening they argued for the first time. Not loudly, not cruelly, just honestly. She moved his water barrel closer to the back wall, where shade would keep it from freezing too quickly. He moved it back, explaining the ground dipped there and might tip it. She explained the wind direction would matter more once deeper winter came. For a few minutes they stood on opposite sides of the same object, 2 different kinds of experience measuring the same problem. Finally Silas paused, studying the sky, then slowly moved the barrel halfway between. Both positions. We try it your way first, he said. If it freezes, we try mine. She considered that, then gave a single approving nod. Fair. That word lingered between them like a quiet contract. Later that night, she handed him something unexpected. A strip of cloth she had cut from an old garment, wrapped carefully around the inside of his work gloves. For warmth, she explained. You lose heat through your hands first. He tested the fit, flexing his fingers. It was a small improvement. But small improvements kept men alive through long winters. Why help me this much? He finally asked. She answered while stirring a pot of beans slowly over the fire. Because you did not ask me to be less than I am. He did not respond right away. Outside, the moon rose pale over the ridge, turning the frost into silver dust across the ground. Inside, he realized something had changed again. They were no longer just learning how to share space. They were learning how to rely on each other in ways neither had expected. And somewhere between the fixed roof beam, the warmer gloves, and the barrel placed between 2 opinions, something rare had begun to grow. Not love. Not yet. But the kind of trust that love could someday recognize. 3 days later the mountain changed its voice again. The wind softened, the sky cleared into a hard blue, and the kind of cold that did not shout but settled deep into the bones took hold of everything above the tree line. Silas spent the morning repairing a section of fence nearly 40 yards down the slope where drifting snow had pushed the rails loose. When he returned near midday, he found Ayanna sitting near the doorway with something small resting in her palm, turning it slowly in the light as if measuring time itself. He recognized it immediately, the silver charm she always wore. But now he could see the engraving clearly. Mercer. His name. Or rather, his family name. His steps slowed without him meaning to. That piece of silver had not belonged on this mountain for many years. Where did you get that? He asked quietly. Ayanna did not seem surprised he had noticed. She held it out so he could see the worn letters more clearly. My grandmother carried this. She said it came from a woman who refused payment after saving her life one winter when the snow came too early. Silas felt something tighten in his chest. My mother traveled these mountains before I was born, he said slowly. She believed a person should leave a place better than they found it. Ayanna gave a small nod. Then she already knew your name before I did. Silence settled between them, but it was not an empty silence. It was the kind filled with pieces of the past fitting together. She told him then, not dramatically, just plainly. This marriage was not only about peace between people. There were others who wanted me to marry for reasons that would have taken my choices away. My uncle believed this path was safer. Your name was known as a man who keeps his word. Silas leaned against the doorframe, absorbing that. So I was the safe option. Ayanna met his eyes directly. You were the honorable option. That is different. The distinction stayed with him. Later that afternoon, he found himself studying her with new understanding. Not as someone sent into his life by circumstance, but as someone who had also chosen the least damaging road available. As the sun dropped lower, turning the snowfields gold, Ayanna showed him something else. Inside a small leather wrap, she kept several dried plants, explaining which eased fever, which helped breathing in deep cold, which kept infection away when supplies were scarce. Knowledge passed down through generations, carried not in books, but in memory. Why show me this? He asked. Because if I am to live here, you should know what I know. And if you are to live long, you should not depend on only one kind of wisdom. That evening he carved a small wooden hook near the door and carefully hung the silver charm there instead of returning it to her neck. For protection of the home, he said simply. She watched him do it without protest. That was the first time either of them placed something personal into the space they now shared. Outside, the mountain remained as cold as ever. Inside, Something unseen had just become permanent. It happened just after noon on a day, so clear the sky looked almost fragile, the kind of blue that made every sound travel farther than it should. Silas heard the horses before he saw them. Not many. 2, maybe 3, moving slowly along the upper trail about 60 yards from the cabin. He did not reach for a weapon. He simply stepped outside and waited, one hand resting against the door frame the way a man does when he is prepared to stand his ground without announcing it. Ayanna appeared beside him without a word. She had heard them too. Her posture changed slightly, not fear, not tension, just awareness. The riders came into view a moment later, their coats marked with dust from lower elevations where winter had not yet fully settled. At their front rode a man Silas recognized. Clyde Harlan, a trader who measured everything in profit, even conversations. Clyde tipped his hat with a smile that did not quite reach his eyes. "Mercer," he called out, his voice smooth like someone used to convincing others they had already agreed with him. "Heard you made yourself an interesting arrangement up here." Silas did not answer right away. The mountain had taught him that silence often revealed more than questions. Clyde let his gaze drift briefly toward Ayanna, then back. "There are folks in town wondering if this agreement of yours might cause complications." Silas finally spoke. "There have always been folks wondering about things that do not belong to them." One of the other riders shifted in his saddle, clearly uncomfortable with the altitude or the conversation. Clyde only smiled wider. "No harm meant. Just business. Some men believe certain paths through these mountains ought to stay open for trade, and some believe old boundaries should stay respected." His meaning was clear without needing sharp words. Ayanna stepped forward just enough to be seen as part of the conversation, not behind it. The movement was small but deliberate. Clyde noticed. "You do not say much," he remarked. Ayanna answered calmly. Words should only be used when they improve understanding. That seemed to amuse him. Wise. But understand this. Some agreements made on paper do not always match the realities of winter. Silas took one slow step forward, placing himself neither in front of Ayanna nor behind her, but beside her. Equal ground. Whatever reality comes up this mountain, it will find us standing where we choose to stand. That was all he said. No threats. No raised voice. Just certainty. The wind moved between them, carrying the dry scent of juniper. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Clyde gave a small shrug, as if deciding nothing could be gained today. "Well then, just thought I would introduce myself to your new circumstances. Town will be watching." He turned his horse with practiced ease. Before leaving, he added one last sentence over his shoulder. "Winter has a way of testing promises." When the riders disappeared down the trail, the silence returned heavier than before. Silas remained still for a few seconds. Ayanna finally spoke. "He wanted to see if you would stand alone." Silas nodded slightly. "And now he knows I do not." She studied his face carefully. That was the first time he had openly chosen a side where others could see it. Not loudly, not dramatically, just by refusing to step away. As the afternoon light began to fade, Silas realized something had changed again. The mountain was no longer only testing whether they could survive the cold. Now it was testing whether they would stand together when the world came knocking. The storm arrived 2 nights later without warning, not with thunder, but with a deep stillness that pressed against the mountain like held breath. Silas noticed it first in the way the birds disappeared and how the air lost its movement. By late afternoon, the temperature had fallen nearly 15 degrees in less than an hour. That was mountain weather. Quick decisions or long regrets. He was securing the last of the firewood when Ayanna stepped outside and looked once toward the western ridge. "Snow tonight," she said quietly. "Not light snow. Heavy snow." Silas studied the sky again. He trusted her tone more than the clouds. Together they worked without needing to speak much. Extra water drawn. Tools moved inside. The old gray mare given more hay than usual. Each task passed between them like a conversation without words. By nightfall, the first flakes began to fall, slow and wide, turning the darkness into a drifting white curtain. Inside, the fire burned steady, but the wind had found new ways to press against the cabin walls, testing every seam, every nail, every promise of shelter. Around midnight, a sharp sound woke Silas. Not loud, just wrong. A dull shifting noise from the north wall. He was on his feet immediately. Ayanna was already there, pressing her palm against the timber. "Snow pressure," she said. "The drift is building too high." He grabbed his coat. I will clear it. She shook her head once. Not alone. Outside, the storm had thickened, the snow already nearly a foot deep and rising. Visibility no more than 20 feet. The kind of cold that turned breath into crystals. They moved together along the wall, using broad planks to push the heavy buildup away from the structure. Not fast, just steady. At one point, Silas slipped slightly on hidden ice. Before he could fully lose balance, Iona caught his sleeve with a firm grip, her stance solid as rooted stone. He regained footing without a word. She released just as quickly. No drama, just trust doing its work. After nearly an hour, they returned inside, boots white with frost, shoulders carrying the quiet exhaustion of people who understood what had almost happened if they had waited. Later, as they sat near the fire warming their hands, Iona finally spoke. Where I come from, storms show you who thinks only of themselves and who remembers they are not alone. Silas watched the flames for a long moment before answering. I spent many winters thinking alone was safer. She did not respond right away. Then she said softly, safer is not always stronger. That sentence stayed between them as the storm continued its slow song outside. Near dawn, the wind finally began to ease. The cabin still stood. The roof held. The fire remained alive. Silas looked toward the doorway where the silver charm hung, catching the first faint light of morning. He did not know if he believed in signs, but he believed in effort. And sometime during that long night of shared work and quiet understanding, he realized something simple and undeniable. This was no longer a place he defended by himself. This was a life they were now holding up together. Morning came slowly after the storm, the kind of quiet morning that only follows a hard night, when the world feels washed clean and every sound carries farther in the cold air. Silas stepped outside just after sunrise, his boots sinking nearly 10 inches into fresh powder, the snow bright enough to make him narrow his eyes against the reflection. The mountains stretched endless and white in every direction, untouched, indifferent, beautiful in the way only harsh places can be. Behind him, he heard the cabin door open and close softly. Iona stepped out beside him, her breath turning to pale mist as she studied the horizon the same way she had on their first morning together. For a while, neither of them spoke. There was nothing that needed saying. The storm had asked its question. They had answered it without words. After a few minutes, Silas handed her a small object he had been working on the past few evenings without her noticing. A simple wooden chair back brace, carved from leftover cedar, smoothed with a knife and finished with careful hands. For your place at the table, he said quietly, so it does not lean anymore. She ran her fingers along the grain of the wood, feeling the time hidden inside the work. You made this after long days, she said. He gave a small shrug. Some things are worth the extra effort. She looked at him differently then. Not surprised, not uncertain, just certain in a new way. Later that day, they walked together down toward the lower spring nearly 100 yards from the cabin, checking that the water path remained open beneath the ice. Their steps found a natural rhythm now, not leading or following, just moving together. At one point, Iona slipped slightly on a hidden patch of smooth ice. Silas reached out instinctively, steadying her arm just long enough for balance to return. Neither pulled away quickly. Neither held on longer than needed. The moment passed like something understood rather than questioned. On their way back, she stopped near the doorway where the silver charm still hung from the wooden hook. She lifted it gently. Then instead of putting it back around her own neck, she placed it into Silas's hand and closed his fingers around it. My grandmother believed a home chooses its people as much as people choose the home, she said softly. I think this place has chosen us both. He looked down at the worn silver, then back at her. And what do you think? He asked. She answered without hesitation. I think I came here to protect my future. I did not expect to find peace. That was the closest either of them had come to speaking about what was growing between them. That night, as the fire burned low and the mountain finally rested, Silas placed the charm back on its hook beside the doorway. Not as her belonging, not as his, but as something shared. Before turning in, he placed one more log on the fire than usual, then quietly moved her chair an inch closer to the warmth without mentioning it. Iona noticed, but said nothing. Some kindness was better left unannounced. Outside, the mountain remained cold, the wind still sharp, the world still uncertain. But inside that small cabin, something had changed that neither storm nor stranger could easily take away. A man who had prepared himself for a life without warmth had found it anyway. And a woman who had come expecting only survival had found something stronger than safety. Not through grand gestures, not through promises spoken out loud, just through patience, respect, and the quiet courage of two people choosing, day after day, not to turn away.